a bit tired, working, got a proper job now. Yeah, all of
9
that.
to 5 plus evening work as well, having to
I know, yeah.
do all your
I know.
paperwork.
All of that. And this, God, what a drag.
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? This is Friday as well, right at the end of the week, where busy teachers up and down the country, of course, are now able to put their feet up for a few minutes or so and enjoy our company.
Yes, bask in the warmth of our conviviality. So what have we got this week? Well, we've not been very busy, have we? Martin, you spoke to a physics teacher called Gareth Sturdy about a book that he's contributed to.
And
you
talking about this book.
And a book that you also have contributed to, Mr. Robinson.
And as have others, Christine Council in there, and Alex Standish. We'll talk about this when it comes up, but
right,
we'll be raffling it at the end. It's a UCL press release, and also not only can you win this £25 worth of book by subscribing to this channel, you can also actually get it free. The PDF is available, and we'll put down the details of the PDF in the comments after the show tonight.
When you say you can also get it free, obviously if you win it, you will get it free. We won't levy a charge for postage or anything like that.
No, we won't do anything like that. You can buy the paperback for £25. That's kind of what I was meaning. Compared to that, you can get the PDF for nothing.
There you are. But you can't wave it about as easily. So there's that. Well, and the big news this week, there was something going on across the pond, wasn't there, Martin?
Oh, yes. Biden's inauguration. And talking about what schools teach, I think there was some rather interesting things he had to say in it, which I sort of got a little frisson and say, oh, well, what does this mean? And how does this change things? But the actual speech itself first, let's talk about that. How did you feel it went?
I think people were just so relieved to have someone who looked like they knew what they were doing, that we were willing to forgive pretty much anything. But despite all that, it seems very competent. It seems statesmanlike. It would have been hard to have missed that open goal, though. We've got a little title that we were going to put on that connects to the speech. Here we are: the common objects of our love. Tell us about this, Martin.
Well, it's a quote from St. Augustine, and of course, Biden being a Catholic, actually has probably imbued St. Augustine from quite a young age, perhaps in his school, which he might have gone to a Catholic school. I don't know much about his, but I need to sort of perhaps look at Wikipedia in a bit of detail. But the common objects of our love, I think it's a very interesting idea, especially after the complete chaos, perhaps you could say, of the last few weeks of various supporters of Trump trying to take over the Capitol. God knows what they were doing, but the insurrection that had just happened. And the reason that Biden's speech perhaps cut through is because of the time in which it was said. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Things are going pretty badly in America. They reached 400,000 deaths recently. And Biden himself, of course, is somebody whose life has seen a lot of tragedy. He lost his wife and 2 children. And that's enough for anyone to bear, I would have thought. And when you hear him speak about loss, and even having a minute's silence, those moments are things that people feel. You have a shared bond with him, a common object, if you like, of something beyond just whether we're arguing about this legislation and that legislation. And it made me think about unity, about obviously, the unity was the path forward he talks about. So history, faith, and reason show the way. This is from his speech, the way of unity, and unity is the path forward. Let's begin to listen to one another again, hear one another, see one another, show respect to one another. We must reject the culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured. And this sort of reminded me of Gradgrind, funnily enough. Facts are important again. Rather than alternative facts, these are the facts, And what should we be teaching in school? Well, we should be teaching facts. We should teach kids things to know. This is what you need to know. And then he went on, if you still disagree, so be it. The right to dissent peacefully. Now, the common objects, of course, of our love are sort of, there's a slight frisson between things we can dissent with peacefully and the common objects. So what are the common objects? Well, he talks about the love as Americans. I think we know opportunity, security, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, and yes, the truth. And that, of course, is the big battle he's got ahead of him about truth. But again, this is something that impacts on what we should teach in schools, the truth. And the truth as facts, but also the truth where we do perhaps have different viewpoints on it. Is it a Catholic truth, a Muslim truth? Is it the truth of, well, he's taking on people like QAnon, of course, who don't deal in truth at all, but actually are in a fight against it. I don't know what you think. What do you think? How does this, I mean, perhaps I'm getting old and romantic here.
Well, Martin, I think what's become increasingly clear is that that whether there are common objects of love or not, what's more difficult is they're not necessarily common objects of agreement, that we can't point at the same things and say that is so, because there's always, it would appear, someone willing to say no, it's not. And so QAnon is a fantastic example, because it's so bizarre and absurd. That we've had our own David Icke, haven't we? Sort of believing everybody was actually a lizard or something like that, and or more recently the Piers Corbyns of this world sort of blaming the coronavirus on 5G, or all sorts of absurdities like this, which people can. Well, there aren't common objects of agreement. We look at something like the fact that a significant majority of us are excited and relieved that there's a vaccine, but there's a significant minority of people who are determined not to take that vaccine in the unsubstantiated belief that it contains animal products and that it's going to change your DNA and all sorts of nonsense. Which I'm saying it's nonsense. You might be nodding and agreeing it's nonsense, but there are people that aren't agreeing with that. There are people for whom these beliefs are real, and the fact the fact of facts is quite difficult. There was a point, perhaps before the rise of the internet, where people got their facts from sources which were gate kept in very orderly ways. And the fact that now that there is information overload, that we can find whatever information we want to tell us whatever we want to believe in such a variety of different places, means it's really difficult and increasingly difficult to have these common objects. But sorry, go on, Martin.
Yeah, so I mean, he goes on in the speech, recent weeks and months have taught us a painful lesson. There is truth and there are lies. Lies told for power and for profit. And each of us has a duty and a responsibility as citizens to defend the truth and defeat the lies. And this, I love this, and he talks about his mother here. If we're willing to stand in the other person's shoes, as my mom would say, just for a moment, stand in their shoes. And we can still disagree, but that to me captures so much of what his job is, which is to try and unify a nation which is clearly at odds with itself. And I don't think it's just America, by the way, but obviously it's the US for him. And truth and lies aren't going to be as easy as that to discern. That's the problem. And of course, because truth is not necessarily something that's easy to discern at any time, particularly, there are some truths that are more truth than others, perhaps. And this thing about standing in each other's shoes and listening and empathizing, And that idea, I think, was very strong. And the thing that we can still disagree, but we disagree with empathy for others as human beings, not just objects of, ridicule or
Yeah,
hate, and the importance of that.
it's hard. I wonder to what extent words like truth have now acts like dog whistles, with some of us hearing some sort of belief in empiricism and established facts, and other people hearing truth and thinking QAnon. And the fact that it has, words like this, which used to be so neutral and used to be so obvious in their definition and intent, are now riven in ways which are really difficult, I think, for people to come to terms with. I wrote a piece on my blog this week about dog whistles in education, and the fact there are lots of different phrases like things like traditional and progressive, which I've come to recognise that when there's a sort of tribal affiliation at work, and where certain people hear a phrase like tradition, they're hearing, basically they're hearing fascist, and other people are hearing, the seeing the importance of passing on culture. And similarly with phrases like progressive, some people are hearing, far left Marxists, and other people are hearing people who care about children, and then we talk past each other because we're determined to go for the least charitable definition that we can find, and attack that, which is very easy to do, to attack these straw men positions. But the fact that a word like truth or a word like fact has come to have this role should concern us, I think.
Yeah. And particularly if you're in the business of educating people and saying, well, this is right, this is true, and perhaps this is a bit more subjective, this is a bit more open, the old facts or opinions, and again, it's not necessarily a straight delineation between the two. There are sort of various degrees of fact, shall we say. The idea that science itself as well is sort of, that's the world of facts, I think that becomes problematic. And perhaps the way that science in a pandemic has been expected, people expect to be told the truth and that's it, and that the scientist says, and realizing that science itself is in process as well, might have some implication about how we teach science in schools.
Maybe. I mean, it does seem like science is a fairly sort of embattled island at the moment, with those on the left saying that it's somehow white supremacy, and those on the right sort of dismissing it as the elite, trying to fool everybody in the mainstream media, trying to trick people into strange behaviour, and the centre ground occupied by the search for the truth that we think of as being embodied by the scientific method is embattled.
Well, all this impacts, of course, on what should schools teach. And when we come up later to the interview with Gareth, we talk about these issues. And if you subscribe to the channel, you'll see the whole interview where Gareth goes into details about science teaching and teaching other subjects. And this book talks about truth, about it being part of the pursuit of education, but as it's difficult to ascertain sometimes, and there are different ways of seeing it, the way that impacts on the importance, therefore, of having subjects, different ways of seeing the world, and the importance of that. But
on that note, and still remaining with the inauguration, I think one of the things that has inspired lots of teachers was Amanda Gorman's poem, "The Hill We Climb." What did you make of the poem, Martin?
Yeah, I was still thinking about Biden's speech, I must say, and thinking.
Oh, you looked like you were moving with them.
I did watch the poem. I wasn't enamored of it as some people. I think the optics were great.
Yeah.
I think the fact it was a poem, a young black woman on the steps, outside the Congress building, talking in a free way, if you like. In performance poetry has a sort of freedom about it, I think, was superb. And and that compared to the scenes a few weeks ago, a few days ago, is quite extraordinary, really. The change around, and to go from, someone with a pro Auschwitz T-shirt inside, the capital, and then to have this woman there, it's a sense of victory, if you like, to see that. And I think that is what captured me and captured the imagination more so perhaps than the poem itself. I don't know. I mean, you're an English teacher. Tell me about the poem.
Well, the poem itself, I suspect is is going to be canonized. It's going to become part of the English curriculum, I think, for some years to come. Partly because of what it represents, as you've just said, and partly because it is so accessible. And I think for the context in which it was delivered, a speech going out to millions of people that everybody had to connect with, everybody had to understand. So it had to tell its message simply and squarely, and I think it did that very clearly. And there's been a bit of, I don't know, fairly uncharitable debate perhaps about its merits as a poem. For me, it's definitely doing things poetic. It's definitely playing with language in interesting ways. I've got a couple of short snippets from the beginning of the poem, such as, "We learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just is isn't always justice." That's nice, and it's satisfying, and there's a cleverness to it, and people are going to be nodding along and thinking, yeah, that sounds great. And there's a sort of, I don't know, there's a low level of profundity which is pleasing, but it is definitely being playful with language, and that's something that I think we want young people to recognize this possibility, and recognize that we can manipulate listeners or readers by doing these kinds of things. Here's another little bit. But that doesn't mean we're striving to form a union that is perfect. We're striving to forge a union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colours, characters and conditions of man. There's a real clashing of alliteration there. There's something almost reminiscent of something like Gerald Manley Hopkins there, with these symbol clashes of these alliterated phrases, or something maybe even almost Anglo-Saxon about the rhythm of the poetry, which is quite satisfying on a deep level that feels emotionally that we're getting some kind of payoff, and that, combined with the simplicity and the clarity of it, I think is what aligned with what you've already said about what is represented by Amanda Gorman herself being on the steps of the Capitol. I think it contributes to why so many people perhaps found it so powerful.
Yeah, and the moment does matter. It does make it. I mean, rhetoric, but the shared emotion, the pathos at a particular time, and you're saying with the poem, Martin Luther King, of course, famously, "I have a dream." You can imagine that being said, in a small room to about 30 people, and being rather, oh, what's going on here? It's a bit strange, but at its moment, in that space, it was, also apparently and interestingly, it's because the next speaker was late, so he had to improvise, and he was improvising around with "I have a dream." But
there's something poetic about that, isn't there?
It's very poetic, and it resonates down the ages because of the moment it was, who it was, what was going on at that time.
And also,
all these things matter.
Biblical allusion there, that it was making these connections to something that already resonated powerfully with
absolutely many. The call and response, of the church, the Baptist church, or whatever.
And arguably Gorman's doing that for a different generation. That it's capturing some of the echoes and feel of rap music, perhaps. That it's connecting on that level in ways similar to the way that King was trying to connect on a religious level.
It's objects. These are objects we love. we
They are.
feel
They
it
are.
before we actually examine it. Somewhere along the line, we're saying, well, that worked. And again, the response to the Biden speech, that worked. And there's so much more than just the words on the page that make it work.
Yeah, and it does. It seems unnecessary and unkind to sort of point out that it's not Mayor Angeli. It's good and it worked and it's of the moment, and I think it's going to be with us for years to come. But talking about objects that we love, probably the most talked about image from the inauguration ceremony was the presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. I think we've got an image. There we are, the objects that we love, and I think this is a wonderful piece of juxtaposition there, with Bernie inserted into Edward Hopper's famous painting Nighthawks. And of course, to appreciate the joke and to understand what's going on, you have to know a little bit about Edward Hopper and about 20th century art,
and about Bernie Sanders and I love the empty chair outside.
yes it does.
that adds a certain frisson, shall we say. But yeah, again, objects that we love. Now, if you're talking about Americana, would you teach that painting? Would you say
that painting? Yeah.
What do we share? And this really goes into the knowledge we should teach in schools. And this book is, like I say, from UCL Press. You can get it free. Please subscribe. You'll have a chance of winning at the end of this show if you do. And also, if you want to, you can get it free anyway. And you can go quickly onto the UCL website where the PDF is available to download. Now, Anyway, Gareth is talking about this book. Like I say, it's got lots of writers in it. Anyway, let's have a look and hear what he has to say.
Gareth
Sturdy here, who I think goes under the name of @StickyPhysics on Twitter. Gareth, there's a book out. Tell me all about it.
Yeah. Well, the book is called What Should Schools Teach? And it's subtitled Disciplines, Subjects, and the Pursuit of Truth. In fact, I can wave it on the screen here. It's just come out from UCL Press, and it's a whole bunch of different chapters written by different people concerning different subjects in the school curriculum.
Well, that's very succinct. I was hoping you'd continue and expand on that a bit. Perhaps you could tell us who's written chapters. How about that?
Well, you're being a little bit coy here, Martin, because this is probably the point where I point out that you've written a chapter, indeed, in there. So that my chapter, for example, is on physics. And then we've got Alga Siegel-Cuthbert, who's one of the editors, who's written about English teaching, English literature. And then there's chapters on biology, on mathematics, and there's arts in there as well as
should we
history.
Get this there's arts, there's sciences, and there's humanities and languages, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So Shirley Laws has done a great chapter on modern languages. Yeah.
And also, is it Christine Council's written on history?
Correct. That's right.
So quite a few luminaries there, and every chapter is about, I don't know, a couple of thousand words long, and the whole book can be bought for £25 from nearest stockist that's probably closed, so via some online stockist, I would think. And also, it's available free. Tell me about this.
Yeah, you can download. Currently, you can download the whole book for free from the UCL Press website. Probably we can get you the link for that to put up at some point. But
I'll tell you what, we'll put it down in the comments underneath here. We'll put it down there so people can then find themselves a link to it and read it for free.
Yeah, it's I think the idea is that this is a book that we're all hoping is going to be really useful for teachers, and so The idea is to get it to as many teachers as possible. So you can get the whole book currently for free, and it's quite a big work. There's loads of chapters covering all sorts of subjects in there, so pretty much all teachers are going to find something in there for them.
But what's the overall feel of the book? I mean, why should I even bother to get this free? What's the point? So if I'm a teacher of history, of English, of mathematics, geography, whatever it is, why should I bother? Whilst especially at the moment, because I'm up to here in online teaching, etc., etc. Why should I bother going over to have a look at this book?
Well, that's a really good point, because now, perhaps more than any other time, when teachers are sort of atomized, perhaps sitting at home, or even if they're going into school, still not kind of engaging in their usual way of teaching, it's a great time to do a bit of reflection on what the job's all about, to kind of balance out the concerns about, oh, have I got my camera switched on, have I got have I got all the technology right, and where are my usual teaching materials, I can't use them for this particular lesson. While all that's going on, it'd be a good idea, I think, for teachers to think about the broader questions and about the bigger issues about their subject. So I think it's a really timely time for the book. But that question, what should schools teach? I think the whole reason that we all contributed to the book is because it's such a kind of rarely discussed question, both in teacher training and in the profession itself. So why do we teach the subjects we do? Why do we teach the particular aspects of those subjects that we do? Why do we even teach subjects at all? Why don't we teach across themes or skills, or why subjects? So it's trying to answer that question, but uniquely, it's trying to answer it from the perspective of each subject. So maths answer to why should we teach subjects is going to be quite different to, say, something from art or languages or something like that.
Okay, so if I'm go along there and have a look, is it telling me what to teach?
No, it's not. If you're looking for here's a breakdown of your subject, and here's pedagogy, here's how to teach, for example, in physics, here's how to teach Newton's laws or something, it's not going to do that. It's a more reflective book that looks at why these things that we often teach without sort of thinking about it, because it's just there, it's part of the subject. Why does mathematics, for example, teach geometry, let's say? It digs down into that and says why this particular part is important. If you to think of any subject, all the possible things you could teach, you can't fit that into the time available. And so you have to bring some sort of process of judgment to bear. And that's what the book is looking at. What are the processes that each subject use to evaluate what is worth teaching, what is perhaps something that isn't worth teaching in schools, but maybe might be encountered in university or something.
But isn't it influenced by the idea of powerful knowledge? Certainly, it's not sort of looking at 21st century skills as a book, from what I can ascertain.
No, that's right. I would say that rather than just the concept of powerful knowledge, which lots of people talk about these days, but I'm not so sure that everybody really talks about it in the way that the authors of that concept really meant it. It's become a bit of a buzzword. Rather than just talking about powerful knowledge, I think it's more correct to say it comes from what's called a social realist perspective, which is a sort of concept that comes from the sociology of education, and views what happens in schools in a particular way. And I suppose you could sum that up by talking about the idea of kind of special knowledge and then everyday knowledge. And this is a concept that originates with the sociologist Durkheim, who talked about sacred and profane knowledge. The idea that the kind of knowledge you get in schools is somehow special, different, in a kind of class of its own to knowledge that one might pick up at home or in the everyday world. So it begins from that perspective and then says, okay, so if there's something special about school subjects, what does that specialness consist in? What are the particular reasons for studying, for example, English literature? What are the reasons for studying arts? What are the reasons for looking at history? And then going further into that and saying, well, okay, within history, what are the things that schools are trying to do with that subject?
Okay, so if I'm a history teacher and I want to go along to this book to find out perhaps some of the arguments from a socially realist point of view, which in itself would be something that might start to make me a bit nervous because it sounds a bit political, perhaps, or something. Is it frightening me? Perhaps putting me off the idea? I don't know. Tell me, why should I go along to this book? That's what I'm trying to get the essence of. What is it about this book that is different than other books, and what is it arguing against, perhaps?
Well, for a start, I suppose what social realism might sound a bit like socialism, perhaps, or something like that. I don't know. And you might think, oh, is this sort of some kind of political ideology? No, it's not that. I mean, I suppose in a sense, it could be considered a political question. What should schools teach, given that politicians and the state and government have an awfully big say over how schools operate and the kind of things that they should teach? And there is a national curriculum, and that is set by the Department for Education. So there are political questions there, but this is not a political book in that sense. And in fact, there's an enormous number of writers in it, and I'm sure that all of them come from very different, political positions themselves. The question of what should schools teach, I think there's another version of that question which children in school always ask, and we're all familiar with it. And it's that question, well, why do we have to learn this? So why do we have to learn physics? Or why do we have to learn this bit? Because it's really boring, and it's every teacher has encountered that question. Now, so often today, I think teachers don't have a ready answer for that question. They're not really, everyone knows that question gets asked, but they're not really prepared for what to say. And I think people reach instinctively for things like, oh, this will help you get a good job. Or perhaps they might not couch it in these terms to pupils, but the teachers are thinking in the back of their mind, some of my kids come from more deprived backgrounds, and if they learn this stuff, then they can go to a top university or something like that. But actually, I think the answer to why do we have to learn this, I think it's a really good question for a start. And I think when children ask that, they're doing something really important. And I think the answer is a lot deeper than just it'll help you get a good job, it'll help you get into a good university or something like that. So that's why teachers should go for it, not to look for ideology, but to look for a kind of theoretical, a rigorous intellectual underpinning for why they do what they do.
So if I'm in my department at a school, let's say it's some wonderful day in the future when we are back in schools, and I take this book along and say it's an inspiration perhaps about how we should change curriculum in any way in the school. We're obviously starting from a completely hypothetical point here. So we don't know what the curriculum like is in Saint Hypotheticals, this new school I've just opened.
I want to go there, Saint Hypothetical. If they've got a job, I'm interested in teaching it.
But there it is. There we have it. It's different than the 21st century skills curriculum idea, I should think. And I'm getting a sense of that. But in terms of the current curriculum debates which are going on out there, some of which are, of course, about a decolonization of the curriculum, some of which are about having more technical and practical aspects to learning. and all those things. It's not necessarily taking stands on those things in that sort of detail, but what is it doing if it isn't
Yeah,
doing that?
yeah, it's not taking a stand on particular issues. I think the whole point is to get at that issue that the curriculum, what we teach, is a conversation. It's a dialectical kind of process in which you have to thrash out with your colleagues and with the wider community of your subject. You have to thrash out what is important to teach and what isn't. And so just by kind of asking that question, what should schools teach, it leads you into a discussion of what is, more technically known as disciplinary knowledge. In other words, in your subject, what are the questions that your subject asks? What is your subject interested in? How does it establish what is true? What does true mean in your subject? These kind of questions, these are all things that teachers should have at the front of their mind, that they should be thinking about, I would argue, to be an effective teacher. But it's those kind of questions that are so rarely asked. So imagine a group of teachers in a department sitting around, perhaps at the end of term or the start of term or whatever, saying, okay, what are we going to teach this year and how are we going to do it? And they'll probably just reach, for example, for an exam specification. We need to know this for the exam, or they might reach for the idea that we need something practical. We need some hands-on things so we can develop some physical skills or something like that. Well, all those things might be really important. But the whole point, I think, is to get a more nuanced conversation going in which we say, but why those particular things? Why, for example, the instrumental ends of our subject? Why this will help you pass the exam. Why should that take any more precedence over, say, the way the subject has historically developed over time? The way something like economics or something was taught, say, 30 years ago. Does that mean we still have to teach that in the same way? Or does it mean that it has changed and we should look back to how things were done, perhaps in the past, to see what was important then and whether any of those things are still important now? It's opening up the conversation of what are we doing here? What are we really trying to achieve? Is the end of everything, for example, just to get as many particular grades out of this exercise as possible? I don't think so, but we don't really create a space in which teachers can engage in that kind of conversation. And, perhaps it's not necessarily so easy for teachers to know where to start with that. And so that's the whole point of having this conversation, having this book, thinking about disciplinary knowledge, school subjects. Why are they important?
There we go. Whenever my default answer to the question, why should we be learning this? When will we ever need this? Is to say that it will make your brain a more interesting place to spend the rest of your life.
There you go. And do they look at you blankly at that point?
They go, whatever. But I think there is something to that who knows what you're going to need? Who knows what's important? It's not about whether or not you're going to necessarily use these things. It's that you change your mind by the introduction of new knowledge. You are different as a result of your confrontation with it, and that you grow and enlarge your capacities as a human being. That's the point.
Very poetic, and it can be useful or useless. I mean, you don't know if, like you say, it's going to be useful, but actually there is something joyous about useless knowledge.
It's that lovely A.E. Houseman quote: "All human knowledge is precious, whether or not it serves the slightest use." I really like that.
That's lovely.
It is lovely. It comes from my encounter with it is from the History Boys, Alan Beck's play, where Hector, I think the paedophile teacher, quotes that. So it must be true.
Yes, It must be true, and truth on different levels. A truth that the poem can speak, going right down to what we were talking about earlier about the hill we climb. A poem can speak truth in a different way to us than perhaps a scientific fact can as well. I'm still doing that with fact. You notice that?
Yeah, no, I do, and we've in your absence, Martin, we've dubbed this episode "Truth and Lies."
There you go. That's it. That's a good one. And it's also, is that a play or a film? Truth and Lies. Yeah.
Secrets and Lies. Maybe you're thinking Mike Lee.
Secrets and Lies, Mike Lee.
Yeah,
How
wonderful.
did you call it? Truth and Lies.
If you're looking for something to do this weekend during lockdown, you could do a lot worse than rewatch Mike Lee's Secrets and Lies. Timothy Spall, fantastic in the scene. Martin, one of my favourite pieces of cinema, the scene where Timothy Spall, as a family photographer, there's a montage of him taking photographs of different customers, and it's just beautifully filmed.
He's a great actor.
Great actor and a great director, also.
Improvisation, you see.
Sorry.
It's working through improvisation rather than script. It's quite an extraordinary approach. Sometimes it lands flat on its face, but most of the time his judgment is absolutely superb. What should we teach? There's been a bit of a fuss again over the well, I'm going to say it. This is something that comes up in primary a lot, but fronted adverbials.
Fronted, full frontal of it. Yeah, I think we've got an image of a tweet that a fairly well-known author and English teacher put out perhaps earlier in the week, and there is a complexity to the fronted adverbial, that it can be lots of different things. It can be a simple adverb at the beginning of a sentence, such as happily he combed his hair, or something like that. Or it could be an adverbial phrase, maybe along the lines as happy as a dog with two tails, he combed his hair. I'm not sure why I'm fixated on combing. Or it could be a subordinate clause. It could be something like, although he was happy, combing his hair made him that much happier. Something along those lines. There is a complexity. But the way, I think, I was mentioning about dog whistles earlier. I think fronted adverbial is a good example of a dog whistle, because to some people, when they hear the phrase, what they hear is really terrible, soulless teaching, where children are mechanistically forced to respond to things in a particular way, and it makes for clunky, horrible writing. And other people, when they hear the phrase, they say children are being given agency and choice. They're being able, through the teaching of meta language, they're able to think more critically and creatively about their choices. And as ever, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's no doubt that there's lots of slightly awkward teaching. There's no doubt that there's a lot of clunky writing. But I think if children are aware that they can change the texture of their writing by thinking about moving part of a sentence to the beginning and thinking about the effects of those choices, then that can only be a good thing. But I think we just need to think more carefully about how we respond to these things. Are we responding tribally, or are we responding sort of thoughtfully and trying to charitably actually think about what's the essence of what's being criticized or complimented here? But no, fronted adverbials. I think the popular children's author Michael Rosen is one that will always contribute to a discussion. We should see if we can get Michael to come and talk to us about fronted adverbials sometime. I'm sure he'd be delighted.
And indeed about poetry. I'm very interested in this thing about clunkiness, because I think there is a role for clunkiness at points, because you don't suddenly learn something like a fronted adverbial and become Shakespeare. You are going to have a clunky stage of just playing, experimenting with these things in such a way that, yes, there is a clunkiness about them, but in 10 years' time, you might have developed the use of them through use.
Yes.
through
Yeah,
thought,
it's
you know.
it's an interesting debate. The fact that, and I think particularly in primary schools, the idea of creative writing has a sanctified place in the curriculum, that children need to write creatively, and I'm not arguing against that at all. But it's an interesting one, because why do we care so much about creative writing? Why is that the hill that many teachers would choose to die on? Why are we not more concerned about other kinds of writing? And I think it's an interesting debate to have. And so I think you're right. I think what happens, though, or what gets criticised, is that sometimes teachers are not fully conversant or aware of, for instance, what's the difference between a fronted adverbial and a subordinate clause. Can a subordinate clause be a fronted adverbial? It can, and all these kinds of complexities, which, slightly miss the point. It's the fact that knowing that there's such a thing as an adverb, which qualifies a verb, and that it can be moved. Adverbs are interesting because they can be moved to different parts of a sentence in ways which is much harder to move, for instance, adjectives, which qualify nouns. And so teaching children this kind of language and letting them know that these things are possible and that they can play with and manipulate the writing that they produce to get particular effects. It's hard not to be for that.
Did you get taught grammar formally when you were at school?
No. I was the lost generation. I went to primary. So I was born in 1972. So I was starting school in the mid to late 70s. And I was left to sort of play around and have fun. And when I went to secondary school in 1983, and I think somebody somewhere must have taught me of what a noun, a verb, an adverb, and an adjective was. I think I must have left school knowing what those things are, although I have no memory of being taught them. I must have.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem with trying to think back. We don't know, of course.
Yeah,
exactly. I wasn't taught formal grammar. I'm pretty sure of that, and was taught creative writing as a process forward. Which by the way, I quite like
a weekly creative writing lesson where the teacher put his feet up and we just, lots of people messed around. I tried to write an Icelandic epic because I was a bit weird as a youngster, but. I did an English degree and all that sort of stuff, and nobody ever troubled me for any of this. After I'd qualified after I got my degree, I did a TEFL course and was introduced. I mean, I had my copy of Michael Swan's Practical English Usage, which was just an absolute revelation to me. And I do remember feeling quite cross that nobody had made me aware of any of these things. And I think that for people who are relatively literate, for people who are successful products of the education system, you can be successful without knowing much, if any, of the meta language of grammar. But once you know it, then it opens up a world of thought and possibilities, which isn't possible if you don't possess it. You quite literally can't think about something you don't know. And once you do know it, you can start to think about it. And I think that, I think it's really important that we teach grammar. But what we shouldn't teach is that there are very simple rights and wrongs. That teaching grammar as a prescriptive system, I think, is unhelpful. Teaching it as a descriptive system, which attempts to look at and catalogue what normal speakers of English actually do, that can be really helpful. But there are some prescriptions that make sense. There are some prescriptions that are right because no English speaker would ever do them. So things like putting a determiner after a noun. For instance, determiner like my or your, ball. Nobody would say ball my, and so it's literal. It's fine to say it's you must put the determiner before the noun. That's a reasonable thing to say but when we get into silly preferential things like you shouldn't end a sentence with a dangling preposition, or we shouldn't split an infinitive, those are nonsense. Those are sheer preference and prejudice, and have absolutely nothing useful when we teach them as musts. But I'm all in favour of children knowing what a split infinitive is and being able to say, I would like to boldly split this infinitive. That I would like to carefully split this infinitive. I think that's a great thing, to have that agency and choice. And you need that knowledge, that meta language, in order to make those choices.
Yeah, and it takes us back to a bit what Gareth was talking about, the difference between the sacred and the profane, the everyday knowledge and the more academic knowledge, and whether schools are just there to reinforce the everyday knowledge or there to teach an academic knowledge that does have a certain gravitas about it, but also you can play with language at a different level. Like you say, if you know to boldly go is a split infinitive, then you can have all sorts of fun winding up Trekkies.
You can, and and there are also, there are also some split infinitives that it would be really difficult to unsplit. If you said something like profits have more than doubled this year, how would you? And more than is splitting the infinitive. How would you unsplit that? You'd have to tie yourself in strange and ludicrous knots in order to try and do that. So the fact that split infinitives are a regular and important feature of English, and knowing that the injunction that one shouldn't split them comes from Latin, where the infinitive form of the verb is a single word and can't be split. There's just an absurdity to trying to apply that rule to English. I don't want to waste too much more time on infinitives, but it's like all forms of knowledge, being able to talk about and think about these things is a blessing, and the children might not necessarily appreciate them.
And learning Latin obviously helps you there as well, and learning modern foreign languages gives you insights into where Germans put the verb, etc., etc.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So it's as we started by saying, there's a joy to this. It doesn't matter whether we're going to receive money for knowing it and it's going to be directly transferable to a job. It changes us, and that's the bit that excites me.
So talking about excitement, and you've been online quite a lot this week, I should think, talking to teachers, and teachers are online delivering lessons to students. How do you feel about Ofsted coming in to have a look at?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? So that Ofsted are going to restart inspections. And they're talking about the possibility that they might be visiting teachers' remote lessons. I think it's quite unhelpful. I think what they'll be doing, and I hope what they'll be doing, is that they'll be talking to senior leaders and saying, what are you doing? What is your remote provision? And those senior leaders will say, well, we're doing this and that and the other. And then the Ofsted inspector will just have a sample of what you've said is happening. And that they're not, I hope to goodness, they're not going to be judging individual teachers' competence. They're not going to be judging individual lessons. What they will be trying to do, perhaps, is evaluate whether a school knows what's happening. And I think that one of the real difficulties and why people feel incensed about this is that nobody's been trained for remote learning. No teacher got into teaching in order to deliver remote lessons. Everybody's learning and making it up as they go along. And there are, of course, there's going to be some people who have embraced that more than others and more competent at it than others. But I think that what is potentially useful about Ofsted saying this is that it will maybe make school leaders think, how are we trying to quality assure the provision that we're making for our young people? And are we looking at the training needs that our teachers have? And are we able to articulate what those needs are and how we've tried to meet them? And if that is a good that comes from Ofsted trying to inspect remotely, then possibly that's a good thing.
And perhaps there's an opportunity to walk in other people's shoes. Perhaps what are parents experiencing? What are kids experiencing?
Certainly, as a parent, you wouldn't want Ofsted inspecting your home learning, would you?
Well, not like that, but but they might be asking parents what they think of the what's going on,
Yeah.
and whether, I mean, the other thing is, which
Yeah.
might be of use, is to say, have you got laptops? Have your kids
Yeah,
got?
no, of course. And the fixation with synchronous live learning is, it's difficult and it's potentially unhelpful. It's attractive and it makes sense to people and they like it when they hear politicians say it. But my goodness, should we briefly talk about Gavin Williamson? He had
The government's responsibility is, I think it would be great to have a certain amount of Ofsteding going on, perhaps from the DFE downwards, if you like.
Yeah, well, quite. I mean, he had a torrid time with Piers Morgan and Santa
Haven't
Reid.
we all? You see what
Well, speak for yourself, Martin. And he was asked directly, I can't remember what it was on, directly earlier in the week, whether it was time to put to bed the notion that schools were safe for teachers. And he absolutely refused to do it. He maintained boldly that schools were absolutely safe for anybody to be in. And this, it goes back to what is truth. It's something very Trumpian about that sort of assertion.
It's I mean, we could talk about this for another few hours about the truths of the whole process that we've gone through as a nation, if you like, or nations around the world, whether to wear masks or not, being told that masks weren't necessary, now being told that they are, these sorts of things. And there are huge arguments within the scientific community about what the evidence is here, there, and elsewhere. It doesn't make things any easier, does it?
No.
But what I was interested in is Piers Morgan asking Gavin Williamson whether he should resign, and he just ignored it. I mean, and other programs asked him the same question, and he just has this wonderful way of not addressing the question.
No, I know. It's extraordinary, isn't it? I think, obviously, if you were to poll teachers, I think they'd be perhaps strongly. The amazing thing about Gavin Williamson is he seems to have made himself even more unpopular than Michael Gove, and I don't think anybody thought that was going to be possible. But teachers hate him, don't they? They think he's a complete fool, and it's. Charitably, again, it's difficult to imagine somebody who was chief whip at one stage in his career could be as utterly incompetent as he appears to present himself. Maybe there's some deep and cunning plan at work here. I just can't really.
That's all QAnon stuff. That is this
I know. Yeah,
deep state idea. But he used to have a tarantula, I think, on his desk and a whip. I mean, in itself, the performative nature of this is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, I think there's more to this than meets the eye. But anyway, as you said, we could talk about it for hours, but we literally can't talk about it for hours because it's coming up to the end of the episode, and you've got books to give away.
I have indeed. So let's
You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues. Lose the blues, lose the blues. You can walk the streets through the lonely night. You can tell yourself that everything's alright, but you're wasting